Hello family, it's African Esquire and I'm here with another video. Before I get started, if you would like to receive news updates about issues pertaining to the Pan-Africanist world or the African diaspora, I have a Facebook group called Pan-African News Press. You can join that group and share news information, and the link to that is in the description box. Also, I want to welcome all of my new subscribers. By this time, I believe I have about 1,000, which is great compared to where I started, honestly, and I just like to welcome you. I just thank you for subscribing, and I hope that you're getting some type of information from this and also sharing information with me, because I'm always learning and always gaining more information by also reading the comments and seeing different discussions that are happening from there. So again, I welcome you to the channel. So what I want to talk about today is kind of a direction I want to take with my YouTube page, and that is to not so much just focus on Black issues in America as an issue in isolation, but to honestly talk about these things in relation to Pan-Africanism. I've talked about Pan-Africanism in other videos. However, I think that it's important that we stop looking at our issues of police brutality, looking at our issues of economic exploitation, looking at our issues of education disparities, all of the issues that happen in Black America. We have to understand that this is not something that's just particular to us. However, just as Marcus Garvey said, anywhere you go in the world where you see Black people, you're going to see the same problems. You're going to see the same exploitation from the white supremacist system. Therefore, there can't just be something that's happening that pertains only to Africans in America, but it has to be something that's going on that links all of us together. And again, that's the theory of Pan-Africanism. So rather than take a video and just explain Pan-Africanism, I think the healthier and more effective way to go about explaining its importance to us is to actually talk about it in a way that relates to our everyday issues. So you're going to see me more talk in an international context whenever we talk about things like police brutality, or when we talk about things like the education system, anything that really comes up in the news that pertains to us in America. We have to understand that this is not just about us, but this is something that relates to African people anywhere you go in the world. So what I want to talk about today in relation to that is the question of, as Africans in America, what does Africa offer to us? We, of course, are children, survivors of the transatlantic slave trade. Our ancestors were the original inhabitants of Africa, and really everyone in the world. We know by scientific knowledge now that all humanity originated in Africa. For whatever reason, some parts of humanity decided to go out and venture to Europe. Some decided to go out and venture to Asia. However, as for our people, we decided to stay in the continent of Africa and work to develop that continent. But for the transatlantic slave trade, when they took our ancestors from the continent and basically put us through the American capitalist system of white supremacy, but for that, we would still be in Africa developing that continent. So it can't be that because of the actions of the white man, we no longer have any claim to the continent. We no longer have any relationship to the continent, because it really was not the fault of our ancestors that they're not there anymore. It wasn't a conscious choice. They did not choose to go to Europe as the European ancestors did. They did not choose to go to China or, anywhere in Asia as the ancestors of Asian people did. They really chose to stay in the continent. And if it wasn't for European intervention of white supremacy, our ancestors would have still been there. We would have still been there. We would have still been developing that continent. So our claim to the continent is just as relevant, just as real as anyone who is there today, because it was not by our own choice that we are no longer there. So it's important to understand, for you in America, we've been taught to view America as being the place where we should have pride in, because at the end of the day, it's the most powerful country in the world. It's the richest country in the world. It has the biggest military in the world. Blah, 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 blah. It has like the most culturally, the American culture goes more places than most other societies. These are things that we are told, and because of that, we're told that we should not consider ourselves Africans, but we should consider ourselves Americans. And instead of taking in the pride of being African people, we should instead be prideful of being Americans. And what I would say to that is that you have to understand, number one, most of the things, if not all of the things, really all the things, let's just be real, that America, the nation of the United States has, it has because it took from other people. The land that we are on to this day was taken from Native Americans. The things that were built in this country, the institutions, the buildings inside of Washington, D.C. and other places, many of these things were built on the backs of slaves because these people were taken from Africa and made to build their civilization. Not just that, we're not even don't even just have to talk about things that happened in the past. Understanding how colonialism and white supremacy works, the entire American economy today is not just built on actions from the past, but is built on continual exploitation. The American government is constantly sucking the resources, taking resources out of other countries, whether it be Latin American countries, whether it be African countries, any country that has the resources, that has raw materials, that the United States is heavily involved with taking those resources and using that as a basis to be able to extend their power to the whole world. So understand that these things that you take pride in, America being so rich, why is it so rich? Did it acquire that wealth legitimately? And anyone who knows about how America is the biggest imperialist, but not just that, but the biggest colonialist, understands that the United States did not get those riches by legitimate means. They got those riches because they took them from people who essentially could not exercise military power to protect themselves from being exploited. So for that, I would say, why would you have pride in the American economy, understanding that this is something that was built on the spoils of people, many of them who look like me and you? So I don't take pride in this country personally. I know it's not the politically correct thing to say, but I just don't. I really take pride in the fact that I descend from the people who actually came from the continent of Africa. And the reason why I can take pride in Africa is because I know that Africa is actually the richest continent in the world. Although, at the same time, the contradiction is that because of imperialism and neocolonialism, it's also the poorest country in the world because the people of Africa do not have control of their resources. However, that does not negate the truth of the matter being that the soils of Africa, the cultures in Africa, the culture of Africa has extended all over the world. You won't hear people acknowledge it. You won't hear people acknowledge the dance styles that they've taken from Africa. You won't hear people acknowledge the music styles that are taken from Africa, the cooking styles. Instead, you'll try to see it rebrandished as if those people created it from their own culture naturally. However, if you ever get a chance, listen to Latino music. Listen to the drums in the Latino music. We know that a lot of Africans were taken to Latin America, and those sounds are the sounds that those Africans put into the music. That did not just end up there just because. A lot of these sounds are taken directly from Africa. The foods are taken from Africa. All of these things that we love, a lot of these things actually descend from Africa. So understanding this, I would be really questionable as to why any African person in America would not want to connect to the continent that has birthed not just civilization, the continent that is the richest continent in the world, the continent that has birthed a lot of the intellectual discourse that we have seen throughout history. Why would you not want to take pride in that continent? Is it because of how the continent has been manipulated by your white oppressor to look a certain way, to appear to be unstable? Well, you should understand that if you're going to not take pride in it for that reason, you also have to call out the people who put Africa in the state that it is in today. I hate when people say, oh, well, I don't want to go there. There's things going on. There's wars going on. If you did a little bit of historic research, you would understand that every single country that is going through hell right now, there's a reason for it. A lot of times those countries, when they were coming out of colonialism, which did a number on those countries to begin with, the people were actually starting to get control of everything. They were actually starting to get independence from the colonist countries, that colonized them. They were on their way to getting that stability. But what happened was the leaders who were leading those countries, became a threat to the interest of the United States and the West. What happens when you're a threat to the interest of the West? Well, they're going to do what they can to essentially assassinate you. That happened many times in Africa. Look at the Congo. Patrice Lumumba. He was a direct threat to white supremacy. He was a direct threat to Belgium and their interest there. Look at Burkina Faso. Thomas Sankara was a direct threat to that country's to France's independence, and a direct threat to France being able to rule over that region. So you have to understand that the continent did not become this way because of coincidence. It did not become this way just because the people didn't know how to run things. The fact is, you always have these intelligence agencies, these financial institutions in the back. You might not see them, but know that they're there, manipulating the people, manipulating the circumstances, manipulating the economy to appear to be something unstable because of the people, but actually it's them who are doing these things from behind the curtain. So what I want to talk about in relation to us in Africa also is, how do Africans in America, how do we relate to other Africans? And this is something that I've seen displayed on many different platforms. The idea that Africans in America, or we're going to say African Americans, and if you wonder why I'm saying African Americans, I say that because every other person, every other ethnicity, they do not define their ethnicity by their nationality. For some reason, Africans in America, we feel like we can't just say our ethnicity, which is African. We have to say African American. However, if you go to a Chinese person and say, what's your ethnicity? They're going to say Chinese. They're not going to say Chinese American, because the American part is their nationality. It's not their ethnicity. So, but for the purpose of this conversation, I will say African American. So when it comes to so-called African Americans, many of us feel that Africans from the continent do not relate to us, do not like us, are just bougie towards us. And honestly, understand that there are a lot of the reasons why we end up feeling these ways, because there are in particular individuals that might do certain things that make you think that they think this way. There's always people who are going, anytime you stereotype a group, there's always people who are going to meet that stereotype. But however, you have to learn how to understand and view things for the totality of what it is. So I'm speaking from my experience personally. In full disclosure, number one, I'm married to a West African, so I've had a different experience than some of you may have had. I've been welcomed into his family. I never felt like I was the oddball out. Anytime I've ever felt it, it turned out to be my own predispositions about how I believe they feel about African Americans, just to basically find out that that's not the case. They really, as long as they seen that I was a good person, they were willing to welcome me into that family. Similarly, I also have a lot of friends who are African, and I've had good experiences with them, and that's kind of where I base a lot of my knowledge on. I haven't had too many bad experiences, and I know some people do have bad experiences, and we're going to talk about some of the reasons for those bad experiences first. One thing you have to understand is that the same way that we grew up in America watching movies about Africa, and we might see, like I remember being a kid, and there's a movie called The Congo, and that movie scared the hell out of me. I was like, I will never go to that place. It looks evil. It looks satanic. And that was, if you ever ask me, would you want to go there? Hell no, I don't want to go there, because the thing got crazy monkeys and they're going to eat me and all this other stuff. The same way that we grow up seeing these negative portrayals of Africa, and because of negative betrayals, we walk through life feeling like Africa is this jungle or is this wild place where people aren't civilized or whatever. The same way you have to understand America's culture is very heavy over there too. So the same way we're watching movies about them, they're watching movies about us. So think about some of the biggest movies in our history. For example, Boys in the Hood, which is, a classic, and it is a real portrayal of South Central Los Angeles at that time, but that's the only depiction you see. You don't get to see the positive things that were happening at that time with Black people. You don't get to see a movie about the Million Man March. You don't get to see a movie about how the Black Panthers came together or whatever. Like, those movies don't necessarily get the same traction as movies like Boys in the Hood. Another hood classic is Menace to Society. Think about, go throughout the history. We don't have to, convince each other. We know that we've been depicted negatively. We've been predicted as being ghetto. We've been, not predicted. We've been portrayed as being ghetto, as being uncivilized, lazy, not smart, ignorant, all these types of things. And we know this for ourselves because we have to fight to see images of ourselves that are positive just for ourselves. So imagine you're in another part of the world and you probably get even less of the positive images, and all you're more so seeing is the negative images. That's really what happens for some of the people that end up coming to America. They see these negative portrayals of African Americans, and because of that, when they encounter you, they might think that this is what you're going to be, and that is the case for some people. Now, the other thing, which I think is interesting, is the idea that some of them might think they're better than us because they have been connected to their African culture, whereas we have not. We have not. Many of us, we don't have tangible connection to whatever tribes or societies, associations that our ancestors were a part of before they were brought to America. Because of this, we kind of are a real interesting creation if you think about it. Like, we know who we are, but we don't know who we are. We're walking around in America and we're told we're American, but we know we can't be American because if all we were American, we wouldn't have to fight to be given the same rights that other people have the second that they're born. We wouldn't have to die and fight for that. So because they're not treating us like that, that can't be what we are. So we have to walk around without knowing who we are, and it creates a weird situation where we know who we are, we know we're Black, we know we're descended from Africa, but because of our disconnection to the continent and our disconnection from the American society, which has distanced themselves from us, we are kind of like in an in-between place mentally, and a lot of times we don't take ownership of our African identities for that reason. And I will say, I personally have observed some people who will look at you as less cultured, but more for the most part, in my experience, it hasn't been that. It's been more so, let me educate you, let me show you. Oh, you don't know this part of African culture? Well, let me explain this to you. Let me explain to you the meaning of the beads or the kente cloths and all these things. Some people, you're always going to have bad apples who want to use something as leverage over you, but at the same time, you're always going to have people who are willing to share, willing to show you. And honestly, personally, I think that the ones who aren't willing to share, the ones who are going to look down on you more, are more Americanized anyways. Because when you understand African society wasn't about the individual, it was about the collective. When you encounter many people, you're going to encounter people who care about you as a part of a community, even though it might be to the detriment for them to do things for you. They're not looking at themselves as an individual. However, I think when you get Africans who come here and they get Americanized and they think for themselves, those are the ones who I think are more likely to hold your lack of connection to Africa against you, because again, they're looking at themselves as the individual, and they're looking at this as some type of way to have leverage over you. So that's for our side of the story, I think, which is African Americans who feel like they might not necessarily mess with us. Now let's look from their side. Now, some of my African friends, I've heard a lot of stories about how I've heard a lot of stories about how we are the ones who are actually not going to let them into our society. So, for example, many Africans, when they come to America, you will hear them say a term that all of us have used. If you were a child that grew up in America, most of us have used, and that is the term African booty scratcher. That is something that is the most ignorant statement that entered into our language. I would really like to know how it entered into our language, and I have my suspicions about how it could have entered into our language, but that is something that most of us as kids, we used to use that as insults. Not knowing anything about the continent, having this image of Africa being these people who were just naked with, scratching their butts or whatever. And that was our image of what the continent stood for. Because of that, we see people who come directly from the continent. These are people who had a direct connection to the continent that most of us will never travel to. And instead of looking at them like, oh, can you show me? Can you teach me? Instead, we might call them things like African booty scratcher. And it's unfortunate that this happens with children. Now, I will say that most people, when they get older, they kind of learn from it. And I think that you can't necessarily hold children responsible for their ignorance, especially when this is all that they've been showed by the media. However, I do think that we have to watch how we regard other people and watch how we regard our people and how we separate ourselves from them. Another thing that I think is interesting, and this is another thing I've heard, a lot of times when Africans come to the United States, they might come in contact with one of us, and let's say that they don't have the idea that we're separate. Let's say that they look at you and they say, oh, you look like me, you're one of us. And they might say, oh, well, you're African. And to some of us, we're so colonized in the mind that that's an insult. And they'll say, no, I'm not African, I'm American. I'm American. And that becomes another point of a turnoff, because some people are so quick to want to dissociate themselves from the continent that they look at being African as something that's negative. They look at it as something inferior. So, I'm talking about a lot of things here, but what I'm trying to get to is we have to understand that all of these things that I just listed, all of the situations I just gave you, all of them were constructed. The fact is, and this doesn't just apply to Africans in America. This applies to Jamaicans, Haitians, Africans in London, Africans on the continent, whatever country you were in. The fact is that all of these differences, at the end of the day, we have to know that they were intentional. And I'm not saying that you can't rep if you're Jamaican and you love it, because obviously Africans in Jamaica have developed their own culture. Africans in Haiti have developed their own culture. We have our own histories. Africans in America, we have developed our own culture. We've developed a very interesting culture given the harshness of the conditions we had to live through. So we've all developed our own cultures. And it's okay to enjoy your own culture and be willing to share your own culture. And that's my biggest thing. Be willing to share it with others, even if they are from a different part of the diaspora. Be willing to share it with them and just give them an understanding. We developed this because of the oppression that we went through. We developed it in this way, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. But when you allow these distinctions to separate you, understand you are a product of, or not just a product, you are fulfilling the mission of colonialism, and that was to separate. We know that as far as conquering people, the most effective ways, particularly for Europeans, to conquer any person has been to divide and conquer. So the divide and conquer strategy is, I see this great big continent of Africa. We can't necessarily take it all at once. And understand, slavery happened way before colonialism started happening in Africa. So there comes a realization, we can't take this continent all at once. But if we create these distinctions between the people and separate them from each other, tear them away from each other, tear away their families and their people, and just completely deplete the continent to the point where we can conquer it, then we will be successful. That is really what happened. They went and took a whole millions and millions and millions of people from mostly from West Africa, and put them on these slave ships. You divided families, you divided kinfolk, you divided brothers and sisters from each other and put them all over the diaspora. And we have to also understand that these things that we rep, Jamaica, Haiti, whatever, yes, we've developed cultures around our new destinations, but these are still products of colonialism. The lines drawn in Africa, the lines, so I know, the lines like, let's say Ghana, for example, there's like 5 tribes inside of Ghana, but they're all inside of Ghana as being one thing. Well, these were not the lines that were created by the people. The people, they were represented by their tribes. So the Ashanti tribe, they were their own nation. The Ga tribe, they were their own nation. These are lines that were drawn by the colonists. So if you allow you being from Ghana, and you being from Nigeria, and you being from South Africa, you being from Mali, you being from Libya, you being from wherever, to be the reason why you won't mess with someone from Jamaica or Haiti or vice versa. If that's the reason, understand that you have completely fallen for the trap. And the trap is that you believe in these lines that were driven by the white person more than you believe in the similarities of you with that person over there. Go to the same countries I'm mentioning. Go to Nigeria, go to Jamaica, go to the hood in America, any hood in America, pick your choosing. You're going to see the same problems. So if we're facing the same problems, that means that we have to have the same enemy. So if we have the same enemy, why are we so worried about maintaining the separations that were created by that enemy? Again, enjoy your culture. Enjoy the culture that's been developed from the struggle you have had with white colonialism, because we have developed different cultures in that regard. But always remember, that culture does not... that culture is not more established. It is not go before the continent of Africa as a people. we are still a people of Africa. And no matter what distinctions have been made, no matter what distinctions we have created for ourselves, we have to always acknowledge ourselves as being that, and understand that at the end of the day, if we have to walk away from those distinctions, that's just for a greater purpose of being African people, that will probably be the ultimate solution to eradicating the racism and the exploitation that all of our people go through, no matter where you go in the world. So I think that's all I'm going to say on this subject. I wanted to talk about this for a while because I see a lot. So I'll say something about Africa, and I'll see maybe someone in the comments say, "Oh, but they don't really mess with us in Africa." Or you see, I have African friends, and they'll say, "Oh, well, African Americans, they don't really mess with us either." So understand, yes, we have problems as far as relating to each other. But if you understand that our similarities, the fact that we are facing the same hell from the same enemy, is what should be the most important thing. Moreover, the fact that we all originate from this continent and we were all taken from this continent, or even if we were left in the continent is still not under occupation of us, because the fact is that other outsiders have come into the continent and took our resources from us. So understand that there's a bigger battle going on. These small cultural differences won't matter at all. And frankly, the division between Nigerians and Ghanaians and all of these things were manufactured essentially to make the continent easy to take over. So if you're reinforcing that understanding, you're reinforcing colonialism, and you're becoming an agent of that in your own life and in your own country. So that's all I have to say about this. I would love to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the claim for Africans in America, or Africans outside of the continent having what are your thoughts on the claims that we have to the continent? And as far as relationships with African people, what are your thoughts on the nature of the relationships? Can they exist in a way that they are healthy, that we can put aside our differences, and that we can ultimately move towards eradicating ourselves from this system of white supremacy? All right, thank you guys. I'll see you in another video.